Hi, folks. Welcome back to Penn State's Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host for this episode, Dwayne Miller, and I'm joined with my co-host from the West, Justin Brackenrich. Justin, how you doing today?
I'm good, Dwayne. How about yourself?
Doing well, thanks. Hey, we're getting some timely rain here, at least in the eastern part of the state. We were due for a drink. We were pretty dry. So we're recording this on the 22nd of June, and we should have this episode out to you here in a couple days. So I think it's very, very timely information. We're going to talk today about small grains, head scab, wheat, those type of things. And as I'm driving around the last couple days, I've seen some combines in the field when we had some sunshine. I think they were taking off some barley here locally. Justin, anything happening in the western part of the state with small grains coming off?
Not really. We're really starting to ripen. I think we're getting close. One of the questions that I may throw at them and talk about a little bit is our concern for lodging. We've had a lot of hard storms coming through with a lot of wind, a lot of heavy rain. And so, we may throw that out there as a gotcha question because it wasn't on their short list of things. But as we're talking about it, I think that could be something relevant to us over here.
Okay. And hey, speaking of our guests, let's take an opportunity to introduce our guests for today. We've got two experts from Penn State, one based in the southeastern part of the state, one in the central part of the state. Introduce first Dr. Daniela Carrijo. Daniela, you want to say hi to our guests?
Hi, everybody. I'm Daniela. I'm at University Park and State College here in central Pennsylvania. I am an agronomist. I work as the grain crop production extension specialist here at Penn State, and I've been here for almost 5 years now. Yeah. Thanks for having me in.
Great. Thanks for taking an opportunity to be on the show. And our other guest comes to us from the southeastern part of the state, Dr. Alyssa Collins. Alyssa, introduce yourself and say hi.
Yeah, hey, always a pleasure. I am Alyssa Collins, and I am the director of the Penn State Southeast Agricultural Research and Extension Center, which is a Penn State research and extension farm in Lancaster County. And I'm also an associate research professor in plant pathology. So the other part of my day job is to do field crops-based plant pathology and do a lot of extension around that. So I'm a fungus person.
We won't hold that against you today, Doc.
We liked Ryan a lot, and I guess it's just one of those things, right? You have to let them infiltrate and get in so far every now and again.
So we're going to talk again today about small grains and in particular maybe some things in wheat. But one of our first questions, and I'll pitch this to Daniela, is as we get close to harvest, and like I just mentioned, we saw some combines running here a little bit earlier, what are some key things that growers should be thinking about, looking at as they get into their fields, running into harvest now?
Yeah, sure, Dwayne. About at this stage, a lot of our fields are, I'll take close to that hard doughy stage when you dig into the kernel and you can still separate it, but it's a little, like really a hard dough type of texture. And at that stage, it's a good stage to go out and look at the fields. And you can even do a yield estimate. That's one thing we did recently with the Mid-Atlantic wheat tour. We toured a bunch of fields and looked and did yield estimates because at this time you already have heads that are set in the field. You can count spikelets per head, and so you can get an idea of a good idea of the yield for each field. Obviously, things can happen between now and harvest, but at this point, most of the season is past us. So it's a good timing to do a yield estimate. Yeah, so we go out and choose some representative areas of your field, and we usually do a 5 feet segment, a linear segment of your row, and then we count the number of heads in that 5 feet, harvestable heads, and then we take some heads and count the number of spikelets per head, and also the number of kernels per head and per spikelet. And that's usually more of an estimation because each spikelet can get from anywhere from like 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 kernels per spikelet. But I'd say an average number is usually 2.5 that we use. And so that leaves out just the seed size that we still don't know at this time. But if you multiply all of those yield components, you can get a yield estimate. Do some yield estimates is always nice. I know we're generally expecting a lower harvest this year compared to previous years. And we actually just had a meeting a couple weeks ago and regional in Pennsylvania, and our wheat yield estimates are generally low as we've seen so far, but not as low as nationwide. But so, that's a good thing. We're low, but everywhere is not good. I just saw a report from the USDA recently that we're expecting the lowest crop since 1965 overall in the US. So things are definitely not great. So I just want to say that also as a thing for folks who are doing yield estimates to brace themselves. But, compared to the rest of the nation, we're not doing so bad. So one good piece of positive information there, at least. I was going to mention other things that we can look at this stage, in addition to like yield potential, yield estimates, is lodging, as we were just talking about. Take a look at lodging. Weed escapes, also a lot of late season weeds can happen at this time, and the quality of the grain as well. You can look at late season diseases, and I'm sure Alyssa will talk more about that in a little bit. Other things that can happen late in the season is pre-harvest sprouting. I don't think we've had some of that that I have seen, but it can always happen, especially when we have wet conditions close to harvest. So all of that, you can take a look, and that'll help you plan some things for harvest, how you're going to go about harvesting and storing your grains. And I think also thinking back of management practices for each field and thinking ahead for next year. Anything that's valuable, that'll be interesting to change for next year.
One of the things that I always struggle with, it doesn't matter if it's small grains or corn or beans, is accurately assessing yield, right? Like we're going out into this big field and we're trying to take 3 feet, or if it's corn, 17 feet, and we're trying to like summarize that down. And every year after I do it, I tell the producer, this is the yield, that we estimate. And they always call me back to just make sure I know my yield was lower than what they actually got, right? They don't want me leaking that information. But like in this case with you and the small grains, how many of those are you taking? Like, how are you getting a good representation of what you would expect to see out there? And then, like, what are you doing with that information? How do you use that to help you adjust through your combining practices? How do you find the average spot? What are you looking for in a field? You don't want the super high, you don't want the super low. How do you do that well? Because I just don't.
Yeah, it's very hard.
You want to be unbiased, but it's almost impossible to not have a bias when you go out there and start walking around looking at these things.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to do. I think you want to choose a representative spot. Now, I think the more variation you have in that field, the harder it is to do that. So what I tend to do is if it's a field when there's a lot of variation, I tend to do more spots and try to always choose something that's representative. So if, don't go to a very high, like low area or a high area of the field. Or if you can't choose, maybe go to a high and a low, because the idea is that that's going to be representative of your whole field, right? So, definitely avoid if you have deer damage, or if you have lodging or like a spot with some like barley yellow virus spot that's there. You don't want to go there unless it's across the whole field. And just generally with, you can look at the landscape, like I said, if it's a low lying spot, or like definitely avoid headlands. That's not going to be representative of the whole field. Yeah, the idea is to be representative. And so if it's really variable, it's hard to do with just 3 spots. I would do more than that just to get a better average.
Kind of like soil testing, right? We can go grab
Yeah.
one quick sample and send it in, and it's only going to give us the data we put into it. So I think that is a really good point.
We spent some time, like 2 or 3 episodes ago, talking about this with like replants, right? Like, how do you go out and how do you like assess this? And one of the ideas that we came up with is, I think it might have been like a Google AI suggestion, was kind of pick your spots before you go, right? Get on a map and find them. And that's going to help take out that bias, or that like you getting out there and saying, oh, well, I don't want to do this one or that one. So I don't think it's a unique problem. Right? I think a lot of people have a hard time figuring out how to take the variance out of something like that.
Yeah. If you want to do that beforehand, or like without any information. Let's say if a field is pretty uniform, a pretty straightforward way to do this is just go in a zigzag pattern, for example, or in a W pattern. But still, I'd like to do that, but it's still, let's say if you end up in a spot and you're zigzagging, you end up in a spot that's totally lodged or something that's an outlier in that field, then just move away from that. But yeah, you can always do a zigzag or like look at the map before. If you have like a yield map, for example, that's a good way to do it too. Just looking at that yield map beforehand and choosing some representative spots to do that yield estimate.
Well, I think it's one thing to go into a field and look at the yield potential that it has. And my thoughts when we turn to small grains is that the quality of the grain can have a huge impact on the marketability and everything that comes downstream. And we've seen situations where you go in the field, you kind of assess things look pretty good, and then all of a sudden maybe the weather turns south and we've got some big issues to talk about and address. And maybe that happens sometimes with some of our other row crops like corn and beans, but it seems like the small grain gets its attention pretty quickly because, boy, when it's time to get that crop off the field and we don't get that done in a timely fashion, things get pretty complicated for us. I want to turn our attention to one of the primary diseases here in small grains that we like to address, and that's head scab. And I'm going to ask Alyssa, all right, talk to me about some conditions that are favorable for scab here, Pennsylvania. What are producers looking for if they get out into their field, primarily this time of year prior to harvest?
Yeah, so scab is one of our worst wheat diseases, right? Because not only can it affect our yield and quality, but it also can produce a mycotoxin that we're all pretty concerned about because we don't want that level of contamination in our food and feed. And so scab is also known as Fusarium head blight. So it's a disease caused by a fungus, and this fungus is pretty much present in our area all the time. So there's plenty of inoculum, the spores that can cause this, floating around in our environment most of the time, because this fungus can also infect corn and barley and a few other things. So we've got plenty of stuff for it to eat. And the times that we start to worry about being at risk for this infecting our crop are times where we're starting to get humid and soggy and also like mild in temperatures. So about the month or 40 days ahead of when our wheat or barley flowers, those are the conditions that the fungus is either producing growing and producing a lot of inoculum, all those spores that can blow around and infect. And if we have really humid and soggy conditions, along with pretty mild temperatures leading up to the time that your small grain is flowering, that's when we have high levels of inoculum floating around and the ability for that inoculum to infect our wheat or other small grains. So that's anthesis is what we call when wheat starts to flower. And that's basically the superhighway for this spore to get into the plant, because this fungus is not very good at getting into the plant by like punching a hole through it like some other fungi do. It actually just exploits that opening in the plant and gets in there and takes advantage of that. So we're looking at that period of time leading up to that open window, basically, in wheat, looking at how favorable that is for the fungus to develop. And if you think about conditions that fungi like, you can think about most people have a basement or a bathroom where you could get some mold growth, and the conditions that favor mold growth are just like the conditions that favor fungal growth in other places. And that's humid, mild, wet, those sorts of things. So when we have those conditions in the Northeast and they line up with the flowering of the wheat, that's when we start to worry about getting a lot of infection from this disease. And more often than not, we do have those conditions as is getting to that point in the Northeast, which is what makes it more challenging for us out here compared to some of our neighbors in the upper Midwest or the Northwest parts of the United States and into Canada. So we always have those conditions almost all the time. Sometimes it's worse than others. Last year was a really intense year for that. We're hoping this year is much better. So fingers crossed.
So, Alyssa, there's got to be a bunch of different fungal diseases that can affect wheat. Why do we spend so much time talking about Fusarium? Why is that one so important to us?
Yeah, so that one, it can not only cause this yield loss that a lot of different diseases will cause, but the fungus itself, as part of trying to get into the plant and move through the plant and infect it further once it does gain access, it produces a chemical. And it's just a metabolic byproduct. Like the fungus is doing this chemical thing to get into the plant, and it's producing this chemical as part of that called deoxynivalenol. And we shorten that to DON, D-O-N, and you've also maybe heard it called vomitoxin. We have the most delightful names in plant pathology, right? We call it Scab and vomitoxin. At least it makes you remember it.
You guys are fear-mongering, I'm telling you.
We're
right?
filthy and disgusting, and you never forget our names. But, you don't want Scab because it gives you vomitoxin, and you don't want vomitoxin because you don't want your consumers and your animals that you're feeding to have feed refusal and GI issues, things like that. This toxin is readily produced by the fungus. It's not always produced by the fungus, even if you get infection. It has to do with the biology of the fungus and the environmental conditions, whether or not it gets bad. So just because you do see signs of the fungus doesn't necessarily mean you have really high toxin levels, but it is a clue that you should check that out. Similarly, you might not see signs of the fungus, and vomitoxin can still be produced kind of in a hidden way. There might be some latent infection that you might not be able to see. So it's not all one or all the other, but these are linked pretty closely, and having one will give you a clue that you probably have the other. So vomitoxin, really nasty stuff. It's probably not our worst mycotoxin that exists in agronomy, but it is one of our most abundant, I would say. So
I know that's not what we're here for, but you can't just open that door. So what would be the worst one that we have?
aflatoxin.
Okay.
Aflatoxin is produced by the fungus Aspergillus flavus, and that's why they call it aflatoxin. And that is an ear rot on corn. That's more common in the southern U.S. and other parts of the world where there are more arid conditions, because this is one of the rare fungi that actually like hot, dry conditions, and they kind of exploit that. So luckily, we don't typically have it in Pennsylvania, at least not to any notable extent. So at least we got that going for us.
Yeah, I mean, we can file that in the more you know department, right? So you or Daniela, either one, you both may want to tackle this at some point. How do we distinguish scab from other fungal diseases we would see in our wheat?
Yeah, so I can take the first part of that. So scab is actually pretty easy to diagnose if you hit it at the right time. And the right time is to figure out when your wheat flowered. Hopefully you were already trying to figure that out because you were wanting to spray at that time if you needed to. So if you calculate forward then 3 weeks, that's when you should be able to start seeing symptoms of this disease. So unfortunately, this is not one of those diseases that we can go out and scout for ahead of making a spray decision, because it doesn't show itself until about 3 weeks after it has already infected and done its damage. But at that point, you can see that kernels may be bleached out. So the way it moves through the plant is it'll gain access through one kernel or the pre-kernel situation there. And then it will grow within that head to other kernels. So you might see like a cluster of kernels that are affected, and they'll look bleached out. They may be aborted depending on how early the damage was done there. And if you have humid conditions, you might start to see like a little light orange, pinky coloration that will be the spores growing, the next generation of fungus to spread around and make more fungus in your field. And so those, you can get a really good sense of how much infection and potentially mycotoxin you have in any given field about 3 weeks after flowering. And you would want to do that then before your wheat starts to change to the yellow straw color that we look for when things are ripening. So this would be while most of the head is still green, and you can really see that distinct difference between the affected and the unaffected. And the thing that this might actually resemble, that you might want to do some further digging into, is cold temperature damage or freeze damage. Danielle, did you want to say anything about what that looks like when we're dealing with freeze damage in wheat and barley?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing to distinguish those is the light pink, orange colored coloration that you mentioned in the kernel, because then that's really a sign of the scab, right? But outside of that, it's the timing. If you have the frost can happen earlier, usually not usually later than that, but usually earlier we can have a frost event. And so if that bleached, if you see that bleached kernels and that's before flowering, then definitely that should not be scab, and probably it would be a frost damage. But outside of that, without the timing, it can be confusing. If they can really resemble each other, but I would say definitely the coloration, if it does have that pink orange coloration, then that's definitely scab, not a not frost damage, and the timing. So yeah, if it's earlier than flowering, then that you eliminate scab. It should not be scab, and probably could be a frost damage. The other thing with frost damage too is that happens in the head, and even if it's earlier than before heading, is sometimes it gets twisted. So uh, the head itself twists a little bit, and if it happens before, the stem, like, or the flag leaf gets a little twisted, and that's a frost damage, just very typical frost damage sign. And you can see if it happens in the flag leaf, you can even see that like all the way throughout. Not when it's senescing, but if it's still green, you can see that twisting pattern for a long time there. So that's a sign. And then you can always think about the weather also. If there was a frost event, then within about a week, like few days within a week, you're gonna see that frost damage. So if that didn't happen within that week after frost damage, then probably it's not that. Oh, then there's just the other thing that sometimes gets confused with the bleaching is not frost, but sometimes we have what we call a physiological problem. Usually it's just the entire tiller gets aborted because of competition within tillers, for example. And then usually the whole head is bleached, and even like the whole plant, like if you look at the stems, everything is just white, whereas everything else is green. And in that case, that's usually just like a whole aborted tiller, and not scab or frost.
All right, we get in, we're examining our fields. We do see some scab in there, for example. Is there a certain level, percentage of heads that we'd be concerned about to draw attention? Or how do we manage that if we start to see scab present in the fields?
Yeah, so it would be great if you went ahead and did some scouting at the same time you wanted to look at your yield potential, because then you could hit those two birds with one stone. I would hit probably 10 areas in a field, and at each of those spots, grab a handful of about 10 heads and look at those. You can do your yield assessment at the same time. And that makes the math easy, right? 10 times 10, and then each head you're looking at represents one tiller. If you see 1 to 2 of those tillers in all of those spots that you're hitting affected by scab, that would be something that you might want to either contact your insurance about uh, and see if you may be looking at high scab levels, high DON levels, and see what they would want you to do in that case, because they might need to come out and help you file a claim. And if that is the case and you're going to pursue that claim, they would need to be present before or at harvest to make sure a sample is collected that can be tested. Otherwise, you may also be looking at kind of higher scab levels, but you might not end up having high DON. You don't actually get to know that unless you send away a test to usually a forage analysis lab will do that test for you, or you can take it down to the elevator and, they will test it along with everything else in your truck, and they will let you know exactly how much Don they're detecting in there. But before that, if you're getting a sense that, hey, I've got kind of high scab levels out here in this field, maybe some fields are worse than others. There's a few things you can do to kind of line yourself up well for harvest. I would say prioritize those fields and get them out of the field sooner maybe than some of your other fields, because it can get worse if it stands in humid conditions in the field. That fungus can continue to move through the plant and make more mycotoxin. So you could harvest those fields before your others, even if they're a little bit on the wet side. At the prices I'm hoping to see for wheat this year, considering our yields and our plantings are down across the country, maybe that will look really good financially to pay for a little propane for drying and get that stuff off the field, make sure it does not get worse in quality. And then that also gives you the opportunity to get double crop beans in and maybe make a little more off those as well, because then you have some extra time for those in the field. So that's always a tough question for folks, but almost always it pays to get that grain off the field a little bit early and pay for a little bit of drying there. I'm not talking, huge tens of percentage points, but most people are pretty happy when they do that with the quality that they're seeing in return. The other thing is when you have a scabby field, those kernels are much lighter than a healthy kernel would be. A healthy kernel is dense, it has high test weight, it's very different than one of those infected kernels that's lighter, it's kind of fluffy. And so you can potentially adjust your combine settings to blow a lot of that stuff out the back, and it will stay on your field, right? You still have that material to deal with, but at least it won't be in your bin, and hopefully you will be able to eliminate some of the dung that would otherwise go into the bin with them and just keep those healthy kernels. The other thing I might mention is there's not too much to do about mitigating scab and mitigating dung at this point in the season, but I think most people are keeping track of it pretty close around the time that we would apply a fungicide, which is at flowering for wheat. And that usually pays off in more ways than one. So that scab application typically is going to help us with a lot of the late season head diseases that you might see in unsprayed areas. So things like black chaff, sooty mold, things like that actually are well controlled with a scab fungicide treatment. And so people usually are pretty pleased with that. And don't forget about your straw, right? Straw is another thing that people are hoping to make out of these crops. And the fungicide treatment that we see go on at Scab usually pays us a lot in terms of quality when it comes to straw and just having that nice bright straw that you might get top dollar for when you're going to sell it.
Yeah, I would just add too that prioritizing the harvest, like Alyssa mentioned, it also helped with other issues as well. You're mentioning straw made me think of lodging, right? So if you have a lot of lodging, you can prioritize harvesting those fields first. Same thing with weeds. If you have late season weeds, because those things are just going to get worse as you delay harvest. The longer those things are in the field, they're just going to get worse. I guess maybe one exception to the weeds would be if you have weeds that have set seed, right, and have a lot of seeds. So maybe just that in that one case, you would want to leave that field for last, so you're not spreading your weeds around. But generally, with lodging and other issues at late season, the longer they're in the field, the worse things are going to get for both the grain and the straw quality.
Most people think fires start with flames, but they don't. Most flames start with heat. Control the heat, control the outcome. That's why Mark Twinoffel with Midwest Ag Risk Control focuses on one question: how fast can you control the heat? Around the farm or in the field, Mark recommends the Enforcer One system with Firebowl foam, built to cool fast, cling to surfaces, and stop reignition. To find out more about this system, Call or text Mark at 618-521-6805 or online at enforcer.com.
Are you or your ag-related business interested in becoming a sponsor of the show? Support Penn State Extension's mission to provide trusted, research-based agronomy insights by sponsoring Season 4 of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. Advertising opportunities are available, and you can register directly or take a look at the sponsorship packages and pricing in the link below in the show notes. Feel free to reach out to me directly by emailing rms6953@psu.edu if you have further questions. Now, back to the episode.
Question for either of you. As you harvest this grain, we talked about the problems with scab and the associated problems with the possibility of DON or vomitoxin in that wheat. But beyond just a standard yield reduction, as we take it to the elevator, I know Dr. Collins mentioned you can take it down there, they're going to do a test for it. How does head scab affect the quality and the marketability of that wheat as we take it off and take it to market?
Yeah, so the way that it is measured at most elevators is they'll put a probe in a couple of places in your truck and pull out a sample. So this is going to be a pretty concentrated sample of just like one small area of your truck. And the good part is if they don't hit a scabby part of what is in your truck, then, they don't find that much and maybe you get a really good price. On the other hand, if they hit the wrong place in there for you, then it could be like off the charts. And that's one of the complaints we hear a lot when people say, I went to the elevator and, I took the truck through one time and they rejected me. And then maybe I went, back and tried again in another spot and it was okay. That's why. It's because the fungus can make a lot of toxin in one small area. And so if you hit that pocket, then it's not going to be evenly distributed around the entire amount of grain that you've got. So is it a perfect system? No, it's not. It's kind of just an index. And most elevators get a really good sense of the general quality of grain coming in from a region in a particular period of time. So they'll do more tests or fewer tests depending on what's coming through and what they're seeing. So again, it's not perfect, but that is the system that we're dealing with. So that's part of it. We don't want that toxin in there. So it's that complicating factor in addition to that yield hit we're taking. But we can also see lower test weights. We can also end up with falling number issues depending on what this grain is going for. So this is a little bit of a problem for everything, unfortunately, and requires some more sophisticated management, I would say, because of all of these different implications it can have. And the other complicating factor is that this fungus doesn't limit itself to just one delicious meal of wheat. It will also be very happy to eat your corn and cause vomitoxin problems in that and barley. And there's a few other oddball crops it'll also infect as well. So this is not the easiest disease to deal with, and it's something we're probably going to have for a really long time. But the good news is there's a whole group of scientists who does nothing but work on this disease together. And so there's a U.S. initiative. It's a national thing. It's funded federally called the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative. And it brings together folks that are pathologists like myself, with agronomists like Daniela, with geneticists who are studying the genes of the plant and the genes of the fungus, food scientists, and those folks. So they've been working on this issue for a really long time, discovering a lot more about it. And our management is getting better and better every year because of that. And we also have some really nice fungicides for it. It's just the biology of it still is staying ahead of us to some extent.
So I think as we kind of move towards a wrap up, my question would be, we try to learn something from everything, right? You've mentioned a couple times that with this, at this point in the year, there's nothing we can do much to stop it. There might be some management changes at harvest or some other ideas. Let's start with Daniela. Daniela, How would you take a lesson away from this? If you go out and you've got this really scabby field, which sounds terrible, but you got a lot of scab out there, you're past that like 20% mark. How can you do better next year, and what should you learn from this?
Well, for next year, I would think about the things you did this year, right? So if you sprayed a fungicide or not, you can think about the chemical. There's not a whole lot of options there, but the timing, as Alyssa said, is very critical. So think about the timing when you sprayed, the environmental conditions that were there. I know there's a tool that we can look into that forecasts the risk of scab for any given time and location that you're at, and maybe at least we can put that in the link here later. That's one tool in our box that we can use and decide on whether to spray or not. Like Alyssa said, we don't see the symptoms, so you have to make that decision on spraying versus not spraying ahead of time. And the only thing we can look at this point is the weather forecast because the fungus is everywhere. And so the only thing missing really is the environmental conditions. So I would think about, yeah, what I did in this year and look at fields individually too. I think farmers are really good at doing that and knowing each field, like different risks with different fields. I think that applies maybe more to lodging than scab because we can have a field that's very prone to lodging versus another that's not. But you can think about fields individually and see which fields it pays to do some practices versus others, either fungicide or a plant growth regulator or nitrogen management, things like that. Yeah, and then thinking for next year, maybe just be more proactive at scouting as well. Not so much we can do there with scab, but at least like knowing your growth stage is keeping an eye on the timing, I think is important.
Yeah, I would add genetics, genetics, genetics. There's nothing that is completely resistant to this disease. That doesn't exist. But we can pair pretty good, moderately resistant varieties with a well-timed fungicide and get 80% control. Now, that might not sound that great. Like, obviously, you want 100% control. But the way that wheat flowers makes that almost impossible because wheat opening its flowers at different times, and the different tillers on a same plant might flower several days in distance from one another. So trying to time a fungicide perfectly is almost impossible unless you had your own personal drone that was running every single day, right? And spraying individual heads. We're not quite there yet, but you can stack the deck against these diseases with using several tools. And one of them is definitely talking to your seed dealer about what's a good agronomic variety for you that also has moderate resistance to this disease. I would say that's an easy no-brainer because you're already paying for the genetics. You know, you might as well get something that's going to give you a little bit of a protection that way.
Yeah, that's great thinking, Alyssa. Forget about the variety piece. And with the lodging as well, same thing. You can look at lodging ratings. So every seed company will have ratings for lodging susceptibility, or like sometimes they call it stem strength, or just the height of the plant, and that can help you also think about lodging risk and when choosing your varieties. And it also made me think of something Alyssa, I was talking with Alyssa the other day that I thought was very interesting. This is just on the research role yet because we don't have precision planting really for wheat, but this is a research where they related the wheat that was precision planted was less susceptible, ended up having less scab because the field was more uniform, right? So because it was more precisely planted, the tillers were all at the same growth stage, all at the same time, so the fungicide was applied to that field and got a better timing. If you think about all the tillers in that field being at the same growth stage, the fungicide got in at the right timing, and that so they correlated like the yield that was the field that was planted with a precision planted research planter in that case had less scab because the fungicide efficacy was better in that case. So that's in the research world. We don't have precision planters for wheat, at least at narrow row spacings nowadays. But you could think of that in terms of regulating your planter, your seed depth, making things as uniform as possible. That might be another thing we can think about to improve the scab and grain quality there.
I think for me, I wrote down when Alyssa was talking about we need to start paying attention maybe about 40 days ahead of flowering, for some of these things. And
Actually, you don't. There's a tool for that. So I'm happy to say.
So there's somebody
all
who's
you have
going to do the thinking for me. That's wonderful.
like that, right? Anything that can think for me a little bit more about things I don't want to think about so hard is great. And we do have a scab forecasting tool that you can use. So the information you need to bring to the table is what growth stage is my crop at right now? Because it can't tell you that. Only you know that. So you come when your wheat is coming out of boot, it is looking like you're about to start flowering. And that's when I want you to visit the Scab Risk tool, because the tool does the work of thinking 40 days ahead. So you can go there and say, okay, here we are right now. My stuff is about to flower. How much at risk is it in my area? And it will light up your area either red or orange or yellow, depending on how high risk it is. And you can take that into account and make your spray decisions based on that, along with, the other things you're, of course, probably thinking about is like, oh, hey, my sprayer is in town today and I've got to make this decision now. It will calculate out for the next 6 days for you, too. So you can use that information in it to kind of triangulate what you're going to need to line up in your world in order to get that sprayed and get your wheat protected. I would say don't go too early. If you need to kind of squish one way or another, like I can't get exactly at flowering, I would go a little bit later, because then you will at least have that tissue open and existing that you want to protect. If you spray it too early, then it won't necessarily get to that newly forming tissue. Most all of these fungicides do much better when you're already started to flower on half of your field at least. If you do need to go a little bit earlier, Miravis Ace gives you a little more wiggle room that way. But it's still better if you can apply it right when flowering is beginning.
Okay. I know we have the risk assessment tool. We have some efficacy tables for people to look at. We know we might be a little bit late, but we're hoping that these will be a good place to categorize all of these resources and stuff for you for next year. So I want to thank Doctors Daniela Carrillo and Alyssa Collins for joining us today. And if you guys have any other comments, we'd like to hear them. But otherwise, we thank you for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So, Dwayne, what was your big takeaway from today?
Well, I was thinking I had to pay attention, this many weeks before flowering, and Alyssa just told me, visit this website, plug and chug, tell us the growth stage, and it's going to do the thinking for me. I actually wrote down genetics, and that was one thing I was curious about, and the difference in susceptibility or resistance to this disease, because it is something that we do talk quite a bit about. The other thing that I think I got out of it was, this is strictly not a wheat problem. We've got issues in corn and barley as well. So anytime we're rotating our crops and pairing things, thinking about crop rotations, it's going to come into play as well for us.
So I think about like all the episodes we've done on tar spot, right? Their first tool in suppressing this, or their first tool in not having as much issue, is genetics. Right? Like anytime you talk to any of them about these kind of things, it's, well, you need to work with your seed company. You need to look at variety trials, because that's a harder hurdle to come back from if you have something that's very susceptible. So that's kind of an interesting thing. The one that I took away, there are not a lot of prophylactic treatments that we use in agronomy, right? There's not a lot of things that we just spray, whether it's an herbicide or anything like that, just assuming it's going to be there. But this is one of those. And it's not just something for someone that's selling to the bread or the flour market, right? This is for all small grains producers, because we learned about the sooty molds are the things that can be controlled by some of this later in the season. So, I think it's always good for us to learn too. If you go back to some previous episodes, season 3, episode 22, We have about an hour that we did with Alyssa and Paul Easker on just specifically Fusarium and some of these diseases where we didn't talk as much about management, but more of them specifically. And also season 4, episode 12, we did one with the disease clinic. We were shooting some notes back and forth with Alyssa that if you're in this diagnostic phase of this and you're trying to really figure out what it is, take advantage of that Pennsylvania disease clinic, send in some samples and confirm that this is exactly what you got, and go from there for that what did you learn this year thing.
Okay, sounds good. Again, want to thank Alyssa, Daniela for joining us as we talk about our small grain assessments and in particular some conversations around scab and vomitoxin. So hopefully harvest is going to get underway here pretty soon. Things will be great. You might be listening to us in the combine cab, and we hope that it's a low dawn level for you this year as you take off that small grain. But again, some things to think about as we start to plan always for the following years. So thanks again for joining us here on the Agronomy Highlights podcast. We'll catch you next time.